everybody's so scattered and everything. It's just so good to be with at least a good number of you that I'm used to seeing. And so glad that for those of you that maybe just our guests, we're so glad you're here. Pray that God works in your life and blesses you through this time this morning. Well, I was going to encourage everybody to come. If you're not sitting down yet, if you could come up a little closer to the front, since we're so sparse this morning, I feel really weird. Okay, I feel weird when I'm speaking out to various. In fact, my instinct is just to come down here and just talk for a little bit. But this is not a normal sermon time. The next couple of lessons are not normal because for the last few months, a few people just kind of indicated to me, I'd really like to just understand the story of the Bible better. I really don't, when I read the Bible, I don't really understand the story of where everything fits in and fits all together. And so I'm trying to just in a very super basic way, just tell the story of the Bible. We started it last week, and we're gonna continue that this week. And if you're like super Bible knowledgeable, I hope it doesn't bore you. I hope you don't feel insulted. I'm going to use children's visuals, okay? Some of the same stuff that our kids use in their classes. And so just a really basic to try to understand the story of the Bible and hopefully get a good point, good lesson out of that as well at this point. So I'm going to go fast. I'm going to talk kind of fast, hopefully not too fast, but I want to kind of help us understand. We went through from the book of Genesis through Joshua last week. And I'm going to show you This is a timeline like the timelines that our kids have on their classrooms from like first grade through sixth grade. Okay, and so this kind of just shows the spread. Now it's not obviously this year that your name. This is like year 2016, so this really should be a lot longer, but we just don't have room for that. So we live about the same number of years after Jesus was born that Abraham lived before Jesus was born, okay? He lived about around 2000 BC. It's kind of convenient that Moses was around 1500, David was around 1000, and this kind of divides it up into 500-year segments kind of nicely. But here's kind of the quick gist of where we went last week. We begin with Adam and Eve. They leave the garden. We go to Noah. Noah builds the ark, the whole flood, okay? Then people begin to multiply again. God chooses Abraham, says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Now we have Judah listed here just because King David ended up coming through Judah. Judah was promised that a king from you will always rule. And then we have Joseph because Joseph was sold as a slave, and because of him, all the descendants of Jacob ended up in Egypt. So we end the book of Genesis right about here. Genesis covers a lot of history. About 400 years later, Moses comes onto the scene because the Pharaoh in Egypt has made the Israelites slaves, and God uses Moses to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. We have Exodus at that point. And then after Moses dies, Joshua leads the Israelites into the land of Canaan, and they possess the land of Canaan. And that's where we kind of left off last week. We use these cards. Genesis means beginning. Adam and Eve and Noah in the first part. 3 guys that lived in tents, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the middle part. God made 3 promises to them. I'm going to give you people, I'm going to give you descendants, I'm going to give you land, and the whole world is going to be blessed through you. He made that promise to all 3 guys. And then we have Joseph, sold as a slave to Egypt. All the Israelites wind up in Egypt at the end of Genesis. Then in Exodus, Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt all the way to Mount Sinai, where God gives them the law, the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law. We have a lot more of those laws in the book of Leviticus. Bunch of laws about how they are to do their worship and stuff like that. After Leviticus, we have Numbers, where the Israelites leave Mount Sinai, wander in the wilderness for 40 years before they finally enter the land of Canaan. After the book of Numbers, we have Deuteronomy, where Moses, before the Israelites enter the land of Canaan, he repeats the law to them. He reminds them of their history, what God has done for them, and what God wants them to do as they enter the land of Canaan. Oops, I went the wrong direction, didn't I? I'm sorry. That's Deuteronomy, okay? That's where Moses repeats the law. All right, now, after Deuteronomy comes Joshua, where Joshua looks very angry here. Joshua enters into the land of Canaan, helps the Israelites conquer the land. And that's where we left off last week. Okay, so here we go. At the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua tells the Israelites, choose today who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve God who brought you out of Egypt and brought you into this land? Or are you going to serve the gods of the nations around you? And the Israelites say, we will serve the Lord. We're not going to worship idols. We're going to serve the Lord and serve Him only. Book of Judges comes along, and it hasn't gone so. It doesn't start off very well, because we find that generation that promised they were going to serve God somehow did not pass that along to their kids. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what He had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord. The Baals were the idols, the lords that the nations around them served. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. Somehow, those people who told Joshua, we're going to serve the Lord, they went through the motions, they did what they were supposed to do, but somehow it was not internalized to the point where they passed it on to their kids, where their kids, it says their kids who grew up didn't know the Lord. They didn't even know the story. They didn't even know what God had done for their people. That had not been communicated to them. It had not been lived in front of them. They saw no reason to continue serving the Lord, because now they looked around, hey, they're doing this. They're worshiping this. Let's do that. Let's do what they're doing. That seems to make sense. That seems to be working for them. So let's do that. And so they began just simply doing what the people around them did. Of course, God was not pleased with this, and so God did what He had promised He would do, what Moses and Joshua had warned the Israelites would happen if they forsook the Lord and they started worshiping idols. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook Him and served Baal and the Ashtoreth, that's a female goddess. In His anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as He had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. This is what happened. This is the kind of the story of the Old Testament, and it's really the story of our lives as well. Whatever you leave God for will end up enslaving you. The Israelites left God to serve the gods of these peoples around them. And in turn, these people around them began to oppress the Israelites, began to own the Israelites, began to destroy them. Whatever you leave God to go serve will end up enslaving you. That's what happened to the Israelites. They end up being enslaved to what they had left God for. So the Israelites are in great distress, and they start they're thinking, our parents, they always served the Lord. They always, that's what they did. Maybe we should too. So they began to cry out to the Lord, the God of their parents. God, please help us. Lord, please save us. Please help us. And God, because of His love, His compassion for His people, sent them a deliverer. Basically a military leader, someone who would help them throw their enemies off of them, drive their enemies away, and lead them to God. And so this leader, what the book of Judges we typically call a judge, wasn't a judge in the sense of holding court. There were a couple of judges that really did hold court, but most of them just led the Israelites in throwing off their enemies and leading them to God. And so once their enemies were expelled, then the Israelites had peace for a time, until their children grew up and they started worshiping idols. And then it started happening over and over again. So the book of Judges is this one continuous cycle where the Israelites begin to worship idols. God allows their enemies to come and oppress them. Then they repent, they turn to God. God sends them a judge and He delivers them. And then they have peace for a time until they begin to worship idols again. And in the book of Judges, we studied through the book of Judges, I think it was last year. And it is a nutso book, okay? It's this cycle. It just gets worse and worse and worse. The longer it goes on, the lows get lower and the highs get lower. Everything gets lower. It just kind of devolves into almost anarchy by the end of the book of Judges. Well, there's a little small book after the book of Judges called Ruth, and it's set during the time of the Judges, and really. Really, the book of Ruth's purpose is to show how God took a foreigner, a Moabite woman, and made her the great-grandmother of King David. Okay? During the time of the Judges where everything is going crazy, there's this woman who's a Moabitess who ends up becoming the great-grandmother of King David. And that's just kind of a little tidbit that's thrown in there that sort of foreshadows, hey, there's a king that's coming. There's a king that's coming. All right, so we get to the end of Judges and Ruth, and we enter sort of into a new era, the book of 1 Samuel. Okay? We call it 1 Samuel because really Samuel is divided into two books. It's like Samuel part 1, Samuel part 2. Okay? It's kind of one big book divided into two halves. 1 Samuel first talks about the last two judges, okay? It kind of continues the judges era and concludes it with Eli, who was a priest, and Samuel, who was both a priest and a prophet, and who was really the strongest leader the Israelites had had up to that point. Very, very strong leader. And so the Israelites, though, they began to want a king. They were kind of tired of this loose federation of people, and they wanted things tied up. They looked at the nations around them. They had these pompous kings and all their court, and they looked really fancy. That we want to have a king too. Samuel wasn't very happy about this, but God said, give them what they want. I'll help you choose a king. And so God chose Saul. Saul was the very first king of Israel. And that really went well for a while. Saul was a very humble man. He was following God. But you know, power tends to corrupt, and power really corrupted Saul. And Saul lost his humility. He became proud. He became proud of heart, and pride is pretty much at the root of almost every sin you can mention. Pride is sort of the core, that I want to do things. I want this. I want to have things my way. I essentially want to be my own God. And because of that, God rejected Saul as king. And he chose, even while Saul was still king, he had Samuel go and anoint this young man named David. David at the time was just a shepherd boy. And David, after he is anointed, quickly kind of comes onto the scene in a very public way because he confronts this guy you may know as Goliath, this giant. And so David is still a young man, but he goes after Goliath. He gives the credit to God when God helps him defeat Goliath. And so David becomes quickly a national figure, even as a young man. And Saul is jealous. So the rest of 1 Samuel is basically Saul chasing David around trying to kill him. All right? So that's kind of the end of 1 Samuel. David is running for his life from King Saul. At the end of 1 Samuel, King Saul dies, along with most of his sons. They died at the hands of the Philistines. And now we come to 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel, very, very simply, is about King David. All right? David becomes king after Saul. Now, at first, Saul died, and he still had a son left named Ishbosheth, and he was king of some of the tribes, and David just became king of the tribe of Judah. Well, over time, David ended up becoming king of the whole land of Israel. So David is the king, and David is described as a man after God's own heart, someone who really sought God, who desired God. He wrote all these songs, that a lot of which are recorded in the book of Psalms, about God and these prayers to God. He really sought God. But David had some serious flaws, okay? He had some real problems. He made some serious, and I don't even want to call them mistakes, okay? Sometimes we use mistakes to kind of soften it. Sin. I mean, we're talking just direct, outright, awful sin that David committed. The difference between him and Saul is that when David realized what he had done, he was confronted with his sin, he was broken, and he turned back to God. I think that's why he was just known as a man after God's own heart. Well, David, one of the first things he did as king is he conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it his capital. It's kind of on the border between Judah and Israel, really strategic location. And he, as you may know, David ended up becoming ancestor of Jesus. Okay, so we've got 2 Samuel, and it's all about David being king. Well, David grows old, and in the next book, we call 1 Kings. Now, we have 1 and 2 Samuel, which is basically Samuel, part 1 and 2. Now we're going to have 1 and 2 Kings, which is basically Kings, part 1 and 2, okay? Just divided into two books. At the beginning of 1 Kings, I'm sorry, I almost skipped over a part. God made a promise to David, and this is his promise. God said, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This is what makes David so important, okay? David wanted to build God a temple. You know, the worship place for God had been this tent, tabernacle that the Israelites had had in the desert. David wanted to build a great and wonderful temple for God. God said, no, you don't need to build me a house, temple. Your son is going to do that. I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a dynasty. You are going to have someone on the throne forever. Makes you wonder, how's God going to manage that? How are you going to have David on the throne, David's descendants on the throne forever? Well, that's the promise he makes to David in 2 Samuel. In 1 Kings, David dies. He hands the kingdom over to his son Solomon. Solomon is the third king of Israel, okay? Solomon does build the temple, just like God said he would. He builds this wonderful temple. And Solomon, really, Israel reaches its zenith. I mean, it's top of its power and influence and peace under Solomon. Things were great under Solomon. Solomon was wise. He asked God for wisdom. God gave him lots of wisdom. In fact, Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs that are in the book of Proverbs, those wise sayings. And so Solomon was this great king, but kind of like Saul, Solomon really began to fall away. And Solomon's problem was his wives, and I use that plural. Solomon had lots of wives, and some of them, a good number of them, were from pagan nations. And these pagan wives worshipped pagan gods, and over time, Solomon began to join in some of their pagan worship. He began to fall away from God and worship idols. So God told him, Solomon, because you have not stayed faithful to me, the kingdom is going to be taken away from your son. Now, not all of it. He said, for the sake of David, I'm going to leave part of it. Part of the tribe of Judah will stay under the control of David's descendants. But the kingdom is going to be divided, and it'll be taken away from you. Sure enough, after Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king, and right thereafter, the kingdom divides into Israel on the north, Judah on the south. David's descendants were the kings of Judah, and lots of different other people were the kings of Israel. And 1 Kings, the rest of 1 Kings, tells about all these kings, both of Judah and Israel, from the perspective of how faithful to God were they. Were they faithful to God? Were they unfaithful to God? That is the whole way of examining and judging all these kings. Just to make it simple for you, all the kings of Israel were bad. Okay? They were just bad. They were lousy. Israel did not have a godly king. Judah had a few. Judah had a few that were pretty good, a couple that were really, really godly men who were kings over Judah. And so the book of 1 Kings tells about that. Well, 2 Kings just kind of continues that. Continues to talk about the kings of Israel, continues to talk about the kings of Judah. Prophets are there because both Israel and Judah are rebelling against God. They're worshiping idols, and prophets are saying, come back to God. Come back to God. You know, He's the one who brought you out of Egypt, who gave you this land. He's the one who will bless you. He wants to bless the world through you. Come back to God. But overall, they did not listen. One of the main prophets at the end of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings is Elijah. You might know a little bit about Elijah. Well, because of their wickedness, the prophets they kept on telling the people of Israel and the kings of Israel, if you do not turn back to God, God is going to let your nation be destroyed. And ultimately, it was. In about 722 BC, the kingdom of Assyria conquered Israel and just scattered them throughout the known world there. And the reason the king of Assyria scattered them is so they couldn't cause any trouble. Okay, you scatter them, you can control them. And so they were scattered, and the kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as a kingdom. That happened about 722 BC. Well, a little less than 150 years later, the kingdom of Judah is still alive. Kingdom of Judah is still going. They've had some good kings. They've been sort of faithful some of the time, but ultimately they are unfaithful to God, and God allows them to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians, who are now in power. The Babylonians had conquered the Assyrians. So the Babylonians come in, they conquer the kingdom of Judah, and they kind of take the people into captivity in stages. In 605, they take some of the brightest young men. Daniel was one of the ones taken in that first stage of captivity. About 597, they take some more people. Ezekiel was one of those people. The prophet Ezekiel was taken into captivity then. And then in 587, 586, am I saying that right? 586, Jerusalem was leveled, okay? Completely leveled. The temple was burned down to the ground. The walls were all knocked down. Jerusalem was destroyed. The people are, except for the very poorest in the land, are all taken into captivity. And now, at the end of 2 Kings, there is no kingdom of Israel at all. What about the promise that God had made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob? Through you, through your descendants, the whole world is going to be blessed. What about the promise he made to Judah, where he said, a king from you is going to always rule? What about the promise he'd made to David and said, your kingdom, your throne will last forever? What happened to all that? Is that the end of the story? I mean, surely the Israelites, because of their rebellion against God, they deserved for God to turn his back on them. But is that it? The next book tells us that that's not the end of the story. Well, it's going to be a couple books from now. There, after 1st and 2nd Kings, is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And they are basically, but from a different perspective, tell the same stories as 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Only 1st and 2nd Chronicles are only concerned with Judah, with the descendants of David. Let me read this. I get out of order. I apologize. In 1 Kings, it explains why God allowed the kingdom of Israel to be destroyed, to be completely done away with. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God. They worshipped idols. Though the Lord had said, you shall not do this, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees. But they would not listen. This is just some segments taken from 1 Kings 17. It's a lot longer than this. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God. So the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. 1 Chronicles basically tells the same story as 2 Samuel. 2 Chronicles basically tells the same story as 1 and 2 Kings, only just from the standpoint of Judah. It tells about how Judah is taken into captivity. And now we find out that it is not the end of the story. The history of the Bible does not end right there, because about 50 years after Jerusalem is leveled, Persia conquers the Babylonians. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, makes a decree and says, all of you Israelites, now they were mostly called Jews, you may return to your land if you want to, and you may go and rebuild the temple to the Lord your God. And so, in the book of Ezra, waves of Israelites began migrating back to the land of Judah. And over time, encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, they rebuild the temple. And then a priest named Ezra comes in, really teaches them the law, tries to get the Israelites on the right track so they don't make the same mistakes that had gotten them thrown into captivity to begin with. And we have now the Israelites, some of them at least, are back in their land, especially in Jerusalem, and they're starting to take root there. Well, the next book is the book of Nehemiah, and it kind of extends this on a little farther. Nehemiah, excuse the children's drawings here, okay. Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king of Persia, okay? So he was an important official in the land. He was a cupbearer to the king. And he had gotten a report from people who had gone to visit Judah and Jerusalem. He had gotten a report that the Israelites were in great distress in Jerusalem. The wall, yeah, they had a temple. The walls were still destroyed. Their enemies were taking advantage of them. They were in great distress, and they were just not doing well at all. And Nehemiah was so heartbroken about this that he goes to the king and says, will you let me go to my homeland, go to Jerusalem, and help my people rebuild their wall so that they can be protected from their enemies? And the king allows him to do that. And so Nehemiah, in spite of a lot of opposition that he encounters, he helps the people of Jerusalem rebuild that wall. In fact, from the time they started actually building to the time they finished was only 52 days. They got it done with God's help, despite a lot of opposition. And so, at the end of Nehemiah, the Jews, the Israelites, are back in their land, at least many of them, back in their land. They're establishing themselves back in their land. They're still ruled by foreign kings. Okay, they don't have their own king, but they're back in their land. They're back sort of a nation again. And that is where really the history of the Bible ends. There's the overarching story of the Bible. Now, there's books that come after Nehemiah, but all of those books fit into that history that we've just discussed from Genesis through Nehemiah. So a quick review. In the Bible, we start with Adam and Eve and Noah. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God making the promises to them. They want the descendants of Jacob wind up in Egypt. They're there for about 400 years. They become slaves. Moses leads them out of Egypt, and then Joshua leads them into the land of Canaan. They go through this really crazy time where they have judges as their leaders, and then God gives them a king. They have King Saul, who's the first king, then King David, and then King Solomon. And after King Solomon, the kingdom divides. You see that little broken crown, Israel and Judah, the kingdom splits. We have kings of Israel and Judah, and there are prophets. That's what the mouth is there for. There are prophets that are trying to call the people back to God, but they do not come back to God. God allows them to be taken into captivity, and then God allows them to come home. And we have about 400 years before the birth of Jesus where there's not really a story. There's just kind of a gap there. Now, some of you might be acquainted with the Catholic Church, and they have more books of the Bible in their Bible. And the reason they have more books is they include some historical books that tell some of the story of the Israelite people during this gap, during this time before Jesus was born. Just kind of what happened with the Israelite nation, some of the upheavals that go on with that. That's basically the story, the overall story of the Old Testament. Okay? I hope this is helpful in some way, but I realize for some of you, doing something like this is really dry. Okay? I'm just basically doing a little class. But we read the Old Testament, and like I mentioned last week, we really struggle with how unfaithful the Israelites are. It seems like they're idiots. And we think, is it really that hard to refrain from worshiping a golden cow or a piece of wood or some other thing? Is it really that hard to not worship stuff like that? That seems silly. That seems kind of ridiculous. And I hope you can understand that though they did it in their superstitious ways, what the Israelites were doing, what they were tempted by, what they were drawn to, is the very same thing that you and I are drawn to. They just wanted security. They just wanted for their crops to grow, for their animals to have young. They wanted their wealth to increase. They wanted to have food the next day. They wanted pleasure. They wanted sex. They wanted fun. They wanted all those things that give a person pleasure. They wanted a big family. They wanted things to go well in their family. That's all they wanted. And what these idols offered was that. Hey, look, guys, if you'll do this little ceremony and offer this little sacrifice to the God of the storms, then the God of the storms will make it rain and your crops will grow. That's the reason crops are not growing is you need to do this little sacrifice to the God of the storms. If you don't have kids and you want to have kids, you're barren for some reason. Well, if you'll do this little thing and to the goddess Ashtoreth, she'll help you have kids. If you'll do that, and for every desire that they have, if you want security, this God will keep you safe. And if you'll just do this, all they wanted is for their desires to be fulfilled. That's the only reason they went after these idols. The problem was not their superstition so much. The problem is that their desires were more powerful than their trust in God. Their desires were more powerful than their trust in God. You and I have a soul. The Bible talks about a soul. We don't talk much about the soul anymore. The soul is really the deepest part of who we are, okay? My soul is the core, the deepest part of who I really am. And my soul has some very deep needs. My soul wants to be loved. My soul, at my very core, I want to be loved. I want to love others. At my very core, what I want is, and what you want, I want joy. I want joy. I want to know real, lasting joy that doesn't depend on all my circumstances, but where I am truly joyful in heart. I desire that, need that. I want peace. I want to be truly okay, truly at rest, truly content, truly satisfied. Whatever's going on around me, I want to have energy, but I want it to be energy in a way that I am at peace. That is what I want in my core. That is what you desire, what you need. That's what your soul needs. It's what all of our soul needs. And all of those things are only found in God. God is the source and the only source of real love, of real joy, of real peace. And so what our soul needs more than anything, really the only thing our soul needs, is to be connected to Him, to be connected to God, to know His love, to know His joy, to know His peace, and to be filled with that, and to live our lives out of that. That is our soul. That is what our soul needs. But outside of our soul are these desires, these kind of secondary desires. We desire security. We desire pleasure. We desire relationships. We desire, I'm kind of losing those, but all those little desires that we have. We have a lot of secondary desires. We want stuff. And what happens is if you and I, if we focus on our soul, what our soul needs, which is God, if we focus on connecting our soul with God, then our soul will guide our desires. Our soul will guide and in its own way will fulfill the desires that we have and will help us deal with the fact that some of our desires are not fulfilled. Because at any given moment, some of your desires are not being fulfilled. At any given moment, some of my desires are not being fulfilled. And our soul guides and directs us so that those desires find their proper place in our life, so that we can respond to them not being fulfilled in a way that is, in its own way, is truly fulfilling. When we attend to our soul, when we attend to connecting our deep selves with God, then we keep our desires in perspective. And our desires end up serving to honor God and to bless us and to bless others. But if you and I, feeling our desire, those desires that we have are really loud, they're noisy, okay? Those desires that we have really make themselves known in our lives. If we, rather than focus on taking care of our soul and connecting our soul with God, if we focus on those desires, and we're trying to fulfill those desires, I want this, I want this, I want the, I want to feel those desires. If we focus on those desires, trying to fulfill them, we end up doing something terrible, something unbelievably destructive in our lives without even knowing it. We separate ourselves from our soul. Our soul, instead of guiding and directing our desires like it's intended to do, instead we attend to our desires apart from our soul. And so we drift as we try to take care of our desires, we drift farther and farther and farther away from our soul that needs God. And we become literally lost, without direction, without peace, without joy, without real love, apart from God. We're trying to take care of all these secondary desires we have, and then there is no purpose behind any of it. We drift away, we become lost. We lose our souls. We lose our souls. And what Jesus came to do is to save our soul, is to help us find our soul and to save it, to rescue it, to once again make the soul the anchor of our life so that we are connected to God and our soul controls our desires, guides our desires, and fulfills our desires in God's way, in God's time, according to God's will, and we have life. That is life, when we allow our soul to be connected to God. And death is when we allow our desires to separate us from our very core, from who we are, from who we were created to be. I want to let Jesus, just in His own words, describe what He desires to do for us. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Pray. Dear God, so many times we read the stories of the Old Testament, the story as a whole of the Old Testament. Sometimes we struggle to know what it is that you're trying to communicate to us. God, I pray that you help us realize what is happening in our lives when we spend our lives focused on fulfilling our desires, and we separate ourselves from our very souls, our soul whose great desire is for you. Dear God, I pray that you will help us. Some of us who have never known what it is to be connected to our core, to who we are, to who we were designed to be. Some of us who have never known the salvation of our souls. I pray that you help us to find you, to save our souls, to save our very lives. And God, for some of us who in some way have at some point given our lives to you, and we desire for you to have our lives and for you to do in us what you want to do, but we've got these desires that are so very noisy, that are so very loud in our life, and God, so easily we attend to the desires, and we do not attend to our soul. And God, for those of us who have drifted, I pray this morning that you help us to find you once again, that you help us to attend to our soul, to connect our very core with you, and to allow you to guide, to direct, to fulfill our desires in the way that you know they need to be fulfilled. God, save our souls, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.